Today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show, a former conservative political pundit here in Kentucky apologizes for ever somehow helping Trump get elected, in which he simultaneously overstates his own importance while pointing out his own ignorance, which leads us to a question. Will Kentucky ever be able to rid ourselves of Republicans that have a loser mindset? The legislature has made it clear that school choice amendment is a top piece of legislation for this upcoming year. Beshear, of course, is having none of that. Then for our podcast only listeners, normally at this point of the year, I would be able to discuss several pre-filed bills with you. But leadership in the legislature has decided that lawmakers cannot file bills early anymore. We'll go over why this move points to just how much the leadership in the House and Senate here in Kentucky hates its citizens having opinions on what they're doing. We'll have all that and more on today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Thank you all so much for joining us. And for those of you listening on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Rumble, I encourage you, please check out the podcast format. You can listen to it on all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify, Apple, iHeart, Amazon, Pandora, anywhere you listen to podcasts at, go ahead and listen to the Andrew Cooperrider Show. You'll be able to catch that last segment there, and you're able to take it with you on the go. For those of you listening to the podcast format, please make sure you leave a 5-star review on the platform you're listening on, Apple or Spotify. Just leave that 5-star review. It's easy to do. It's a simple thing to do. I sit here day after day, 5 days a week, giving you the news and political information you need. The least you could do is leave a review and tell others about it. If you're sitting next to someone, tell them, hey, listen to the Andrew Cooperrider Show. If you're politically involved, ask your other politically involved friends, hey, are you checking out the Andrew Cooperrider Show? Did you hear what he talked about last time? Those types of things spread the word. They spread the podcast. They grow it. And by growing it, we can make a larger impact on what's going on here in Kentucky. Without further ado, let's dig into it. I apologize. That is the name of an article wrote for the Kentucky Lantern by a former columnist and political pundit, supposed conservative columnist and political pundit named John David Dyche. I'm gonna be honest. I have no clue how to say that last name of that man right there. I've no clue. I've never heard it before. In fact, because of my age, or maybe because I really didn't pay attention till state politics here in Kentucky till about 2018, I've never heard that name before here recently in this article he wrote. And so he writes this apology talking about how he's helped get Trump elected through the work he did supporting, I guess, the GOP as a pundit here in Kentucky. But I have to wonder if he really ever made a tangible impact at all, from the very simple fact that I've literally never heard his name before. So clearly this article is therefore an attempt by a man apparently who has lost all relevance in Kentucky politics to somehow become relevant again. Now, to his credit, he has, albeit for being yet another Republican from a bygone era of people with a losing mindset, he's made himself relevant again, at least enough that I've now heard his name, and I'm going to talk about his article and talk about the type of person he is. Because he's the type of person who romanticizes their own thoughts about the Reagan presidency without admitting to themselves they probably never supported Reagan at all, or at least not until he became president. Someone who says Reagan was a great president by looking at the numbers, but never actually bothered to understand what made Reagan so great after all. He was a man of action, a man hated by the Republican establishment, a man hated because he didn't check all those perfect political boxes, the boxes that people like John David Dyche, whatever his last name is, those boxes that he cares about. He wasn't the president of the Young Republicans at some point. He didn't pay his political dues interning under some Republican senator. He wasn't Mitch McConnell's attorney, something, by the way, 3 of our top candidates for statewide offices have all been at some point. Now, he didn't check those boxes, and because he didn't check those boxes, he was hated. Now, like then, the GOP is going through a realignment away from a losing mindset of playing prevent defense in politics, and a realignment of voters who are tired of losing. I'm not talking about losing elections. I'm talking about losing their country, their state, their lives, their incomes, their futures. And when I talk to a Politico and I say, wow, Kentucky Republicans really have been losing, they look around and they say, what do you mean? We win all kinds of elections. But winning elections doesn't matter. It's about what you do after you win those elections. And the fact of the matter is that the Republican legislature in Kentucky took over control in January of 2017. And since then, the net result has been higher spending and a higher tax burden on the individuals. Now, Republicans, of course, in the legislature will claim they cut taxes, and they claim that because, of course, of the income tax cuts they've made, but they've added categories to our sales tax, and they've brought in more revenue, something you can only do, something if you have a little bit of brain power, means they have to have raised that tax burden by increasing taxes, fees, and licenses in other places. We get half measures on everything from CRT to economic development. They promise to deregulate that Republicans say, yet never comes to Kentucky, as Kentucky is, bureaucratically speaking, one of the worst states to do business in, as far as the bureaucratic process goes, as far as filing fees and where you have to file them and who you have to ask to get those things taken care of, and just generally the computer systems and the whole process of it. And I'm telling you, as a person who has LLCs in Kentucky, and I own LLCs in other states, I can tell you right now, Kentucky is one of the, if not the hardest states to file in and have a business license in, or file your LLC in for the state, and to then move forward by paying all your taxes, fees, and licenses. It's absolutely awful. There's a reason why you'll talk to these national companies and they'll try to be registered perhaps in Texas or Delaware or Wyoming or some of these other places, but you never hear them saying, let's register in Kentucky. It's the best place for us to register our business, because it's not. And yet undoing those things would help our economic development, making our business processes more streamlined and changing the way we do those licenses. But yet instead, our Republican legislature has felt fit, instead of doing economic development the way Republicans promised to, getting government out of the way, instead they've decided to give hundreds of millions of dollars to privately held companies in cash in order to get them to come to Kentucky. Now, this former pundit, John David Dyche, I'm sorry, I had to recheck his name again. I already forgot his name. I've show notes as I'm going through this, and I wrote David down. I'm like, I swear his name was John David something. But this former pundit, John, still has that losing mindset, that if things aren't decided by rich men in back rooms drinking bourbon while they play chess with other people's lives, well, that's just too uncivilized for him to handle. His desire for the corrupt, untransparent, and good old boy political system to remain around has driven him blind to the facts of the situations. And maybe as a pundit, he claimed to be about transparency and calling out corruption. I don't know. I didn't read anything he has wrote other than this right here. But really, I don't need to. Because if this is his magnus opus, his last breath, his comeback, his hope to be relevant again, if this article is an indicator of his ability to critically think and follow facts, well, then all of his other writings must be complete and utter garbage, and his entire body of work must be called under question. Now, for some of my listeners, you may know exactly who this guy is, and maybe you're saying, Andrew, you're passing judgment. You don't know him. He's really important. He did some great work. You're just too young to understand. Well, let me read off a few quotes from his articles and see if I can't make a case for why I'm right. And of course, if you have no idea who this guy is, well, me just going over this will tell you everything you need to know about him. Here's one of the first lines from when you get down to the meat of his article, of his little opinion piece he wrote. He says, Republicans who would profess love of freedom and abhorrence of authoritarianism and tyranny nominated Trump, an principled demagogue who colluded with and openly sought and accepted help from Russia and its strongman, Vladimir Putin. In this one line, he calls Trump an authoritarian and a tyrant. Now, at any point of this in this article, does he provide proof of Trump's supposed tyranny? What does he define as tyranny? What does he point to and say that is tyranny? No, he doesn't, and he can't, and he won't, because the truth is Trump deregulated. Trump provided more press access than Joe Biden or Obama did. He didn't attempt to use the FBI to go after his political enemies. The man that is currently under several indictments across the country based upon novel legal theories. A former president under indictment based upon novel legal theories. And John's twisted mind is the tyrant in all of this. Trump didn't start any wars. In fact, he attempted to de-escalate and end wars. That doesn't sound like a tyrant. Then to cap it all off, he proclaims the Trump-Russia collusion storyline lie, something that has long since been debunked, and nothing more than a Clinton-fueled lie campaign that came out of the Clinton campaign. Russiagate never happened. John needs to turn off MSNBC. He clearly doesn't have an original or thoughtful conclusion. If he didn't even bother to research his article or point out anything that he's talking about, because if he had, he maybe would have figured out that Trump never colluded with Russia, or he would have maybe been able to point to what was so tyrannical about Trump to begin with. Because, of course, maybe I'm not his pointed audience, but I've got questions. I'm pretty well informed. I'd like to know exactly what he thinks that Trump did that was so tyrannical. Or how does he think Trump colluded with Russia? Now, after this, John goes on to say, Trump played footsie with dictators he obviously admired while undermining America's key alliances with Democratic friends. You know what I know? Russia didn't invade Ukraine while Trump was in office. Israel wasn't at war with Gaza and Hamas and worried about going to war with Iran. China and Taiwan wasn't really a concern. I didn't really hear that all often talked about. I mean, what's next, John? You're going to claim Trump almost started a nuclear war? You know, that common story. Trump almost brought us to nuclear war. Trump was going to bring us to nuclear war, while ignoring the fact that the neocon warmongers in our own party, like Lindsey Graham, are trying to start a war with Iran and want to keep pushing on Russia, an actual nuclear country, a country with nuclear warheads. Now, John goes on to say Republicans who had pretended to judge people on the content of their characters stayed mute at the hateful and hate-filled Trump routinely practiced cruelty, misogyny, racism, and xenophobia with sickening relish. And there it is. The old classic, Trump is a big old mean racist and hated people from other countries because he simply wanted to care about America first. You know, the ones who are actually paying the taxes and the ones that the government is actually supposed to represent. If we ask John for an actual example of racism and xenophobia, John probably has nothing to say, or better yet, he might point to bans coming from countries around the world that have nothing, people coming from third world countries around the world, or places where we can't do good background checks, places where we banned immigration from for national security, perhaps during the pandemic, or perhaps because of a Muslim terror states that the country represented. You know, caring about America first. But that's not good enough for John. He can't point to racism or xenophobia. He doesn't provide any evidence, nothing that we can debate, nothing for his readers to critically think about and say, well, was that racist? Was that xenophobia? Was that wrong to do? No. He doesn't have an answer. I mean, clearly a person who still spouts Trump Russiagate and says things are much better with us almost at war with countries rather than Trump being nice with other countries to avoid war and conflict doesn't actually research what they're saying or critically think about it. He expects us to buy it. He expects us to buy into the fact that he just must be some expert and we should take everything he says at face value. As I said, I guess we're not his audience. The liberals in Kentucky are now his audience. That's who he's trying to find acceptance from, because he no longer has relevance in the GOP, and he's just struggling and hoping that people will remember his name. At one point, John really falls off a cliff, deciding to show his name-calling chops, his ability to pull out the dictionary and a thesaurus, and his name-calling chops, this tirade he goes on in this article, would make any white wig-wearing elitists of old proud to stand beside him now. And to quote him from the article, this is what he says. He says, to stand with or silently tolerate Trump and Trumpism is to effectively support his bigotry, criminality, demagoguery, despotism, hate, hypocrisy, ignorance, indecency, insurrection, irrationality, lying, narcissism, proto-fascism, sacrilege, sedition, venality, violence, and vulgarity. He said all that in one stream. You lint liquor. Reminds me of that old Orbit commercial. Anyways, so how does David and his Lincoln Project MSNBC talking point filled article, where he blathers nonsensically all the bad adjectives he can think of about Trump, while providing absolutely nothing as evidence to point to in order to back up his Trump Derangement Syndrome hissy fit? How does he end this? He ends this by saying this: Trump is not merely dangerous, he is evil. This is not something I say lightly, but it must be said. It remains difficult to understand and accept that so many Republicans support, even worship this bad man, but they do. And they will no matter what. The party of Lincoln, not to mention Theodore Roosevelt, Dwight Eisenhower, and Ronald Reagan, is now thoroughly and irredeemably the party of Trump. American constitutional democracy is at great risk as a result. By my past public support of the Republican Party and its craven Trump collaborators, I, to some degree, helped it happen. For that, Kentucky, I apologize. Well, John David Dyche, or however you say your last name, you don't have to apologize. Your contributions aren't felt. You didn't help us. We didn't win the House in Kentucky until Trump came in. And people in our House were able to coattail in order to gain our current majority. Let me give you an example. In 2004, there were 57 Democrats in the House, in the state House. And in 2014, 2 years before Trump, there was 54. Then Trump in 2016, and Republicans now had a 64-seat majority. Went from 46 to 64 because of Trump. Wasn't because of John. Wasn't because of his loser mindset Republicans. It was that majority that they floated in on. It was Republicans' coattails they rode in on, and yet he apologizes for pushing him forward and helping to make that happen. You didn't help make anything happen. We didn't become a majority because of anything you did, John. You didn't help. Now, Trump was able to do this because maybe people and the type of Republicans we have now, maybe they're voted on by people who are tired of getting screwed around by people like John, who prefer to have politicians that sit in oak-paneled rooms voicing angry retorts about the masses of people who just don't understand how government works. Y'all can go back to pushing the idea that you're the adults in the room, and I'll go back to pushing for conservatives that get things done and win, not only in elections, but win in policy, win in getting our country and our state back. And now that I've made every redcoat political spit out their tea as they listen to this young upstart, even though I'm in my 30s, now that I've made them spit out their tea, understand this. I'm not saying this about John because I'm an always Trumper. I'm not. I can point out where Trump has gone wrong at times, both in policy and endorsements. I can give you actual examples, such as the bump stock ban, going after Massey for forcing Congress to vote on the relief package in person during COVID, not firing Fauci. Those are missteps he made, and I know the man isn't perfect. But I'll tell you what, the net result on my life by a Trump presidency was a whole heck of a lot better than Bush, Obama, or Biden. And I've seen what kind of neocon warmongers we could have had for presidents with McCain and Romney. Now, I'm not saying this because of a blind Trump allegiance. Anyone who follows the show knows I have no allegiance to any politicians at all. And I have no qualms about calling out any of them when they do something that is wrong. I'm saying this about John because he is a fool who apparently isn't able to think for himself or come to an original thought. Now, coming up, as the legislature makes clear school choice amendment will be a priority for the upcoming session, Beshear reiterates his opposition to it, saying it sends money to unaccountable schools. We'll take a look at his comments after this short break.
Lexington Overstock Warehouse is Central Kentucky's best source for stylish new home furnishings. Don't pay retail. With our low overhead operating structure and big name brands, we offer the absolute best values on new furniture for every room. Shop online anytime at LexingtonOverstockWarehouse.com or visit our weekends only showroom located at 156 West Tiverton Way. Right now, for listeners of this show, we're offering a special discount for our online customers. Use coupon code FREEDOM for an additional 10% off your online order today. Lexington Overstock Warehouse, low overhead equals really low prices.
859 Print has local service and low prices. I personally have done tons of business with them. And I can tell you, whether it is getting things printed off, sending direct mail, making business cards, buying TV ad time, digital marketing, they can do it all. And as a special for listeners of this show, they're offering 10% off any and all print services using code RIDER 2024. That is code RIDER 2024 for 10% off. Check out 859 Print. You'll be glad you did. The best non-magnet public school in Kentucky, middle school, in reading proficiency is W.B. Munch Elementary, which covers K through 8th grade. And their reading proficiency is 69%, and their math proficiency is 54%, meaning that the percentage of kids, 69 and 54, are where they should be at that grade level. The lowest performing non-special education standard public school, middle school in Kentucky is Magoffin County High, which covers 7th through 12th grade, where just 19% of kids are proficient in reading and only 9% are proficient in math. The best we can hope for in Kentucky from standard public schools is 69% in reading, or in public school terms, K through 12 terms, a D. Objectively, therefore, our public schools in Kentucky are failing our students. At the most we can hope for is a D. They're failing by their own definition of grades. And it's not a money issue as much as the left loves to mash their teeth about it. At or above proficiency level in Jefferson County schools, where they spend over $20,000 a student. According to the National Center for Educational Statistics, their reading proficiency level is 26%. So we have failing schools. Money can't seem to fix it. And so Kentucky, like many other states, is looking at school choice programs as an option to fix this. Only in Kentucky, we have a snag. You see, our state constitution says that the state is to provide a public school system. A similar thing in other state constitutions, but for some reason, our state Supreme Court priorly has interpreted that to mean that we can't have school choice in Kentucky. A system where parents are empowered to pick their schools they would like to go to, and then the state pays the tuition or at least part of it. In order for Kentucky to enjoy this type of system, a system that even the farthest left anti-school choice activists can only claim has no effect, while advocates for school choice can point to places where huge gains have been made. So worst case scenario, according to even the activists, is nothing happens. We spend the same amount. But the best case, we spend the same amount and scores improve. Really a no-lose situation. Doesn't cost us any more, and we have the opportunity to have better performing children. In order to achieve educational choice in Kentucky, we must therefore pass a constitutional amendment. And that we have to do that before a program can be realistically discussed. And passing an amendment doesn't mean school choice happens tomorrow. It means that legislators will now have the option to put together a program. Well, getting this amendment onto the ballot in 2024 is supposedly a top priority for our legislature this year, but Beshear is having none of it. His attacks against this include lines like, oh, well, this will defund public schools and send money to private schools that have no accountability. A broad claim, considering, well, the actual program doesn't exist yet, but also a statement that completely ignores that these schools will be accountable to someone. In fact, accountable to the people who at least should care the most about the kids and their educational outcomes, the child's parents. That is who the schools would be accountable to. Because if a school underperforms and doesn't provide the services and the learning that a parent's child needs, well, they are free now to pick a different school. It's a free market. These schools are now accountable to the parents. Perhaps Beshear's real issue is because if schooling becomes about the student's success and schools being held accountable by the parents, all of that fat, bloated salaries of school administrators might go away or at least be reduced. Let's take a look at the Kentucky Department of Education. The KDE, Kentucky Department of Education, has 67 people in it with salaries over $100,000 a year. To put that in perspective, the entire state's prison system, a department that does a key function of government, handles criminal justice, or part of it at least, jails. They themselves operate facilities too. I mean, keep in mind, the school systems and building, KDE doesn't have school buildings and school systems. The school districts have that. All they do is administer money and create regulations and provide resources to the schools. They don't have actual things like, prisons to operate. So KDE has 67. The entire justice system in KY. This is juvenile justice. This is state detention centers. This is all of that together. You know how many people they have being paid over $100,000 a year? 27. KDE has 67, and our jails and juvenile justice centers and detention centers only have 27 people being paid over $100,000 a year. I mean, shoot, KSP only has 103. And they're the entire police department for the state. They have detectives and other things that work out in rural areas. The entire Department of Revenue, the tax collectors, key function of our government to run collecting up your taxes, has 10 people paid over $100K a year. But somehow, KDE, which doesn't operate a school, has 67 people paid over $100,000 a year. If education starts focusing on the student and not the government employees, well, we can't have that. The money can't go to the student. It's got to go to these fat administrative salaries. You see, that's the real concern. It's not about teachers or students. It's always been about the administrators. When you take a look at their union leaders of like our teachers unions and school unions here in Kentucky, you see many administrators, not very many teachers. I mean, even Jacqueline Coleman, Beshear's lieutenant governor, she claims she was a teacher, and she was for at least 7, maybe 10 years at the most. Then she became a school administrator. She didn't slug it out in the classroom for 20 years and is now advocating for teachers. No, she spent time as a school administrator until she was called up as lieutenant governor. She hopped between 2 different schools as a teacher, and then she landed that nice admin job and then a nonprofit job, and then found while she's working a nonprofit job, I guess, and then found herself as Beshear's lieutenant governor. Now, there's nothing wrong with being a school admin, but that's what Beshear is protecting. That's what Beshear's school plan is protecting. That's what he's going after. He's protecting school administrators, not teachers, not students, but administrators. Take a look at his education plan. It's not a 10% raise for teachers. It's a 10% raise for everyone, not just the teachers. I mean, he'll use the teachers as cover to justify a 10% raise that then he's going to hand out to those all-important admins that earn way more money than teachers ever could hope to. And I think that's a real insidious thing about all of this, because if it's about educational outcomes, if it's about the kids, not protecting government employees, but how do we get our biggest bang for the buck for these kids? School choice is at least a chance at that. I mean, we have tried everything else and it's failing. I mean, what actual solutions to our failing school system has Beshear offered here? Andy says, well, we just need to spend more money, but he can't tell us exactly how much we need to spend to get the educational outcomes we need. He puts forward things like universal pre-K. But do we really think that if you get a hold of our kids another year or two early, that will somehow fix it when you've had our kids for 9 years in 8th grade and not even half, in most of the schools, not even half of those kids are proficient in reading or math? Throw money at it. That's always the Democrats' solution, but they can't even tell you a dollar amount or how much it's going to take. They don't have a number, because what they're worried about is if they do name a number, you might actually give it to them, and then they'll be expected to perform. It is clearly time for something different. I know there can be downsides to school choice in small communities, and we have to look at that. And when we craft the policy after the amendment passes, we have to take that into consideration. But once again, we can't have that discussion until the amendment has passed. Well, coming up, the leadership in the legislature has taken steps to make sure citizens become as disengaged as possible. That is the topic we're coming up with next for our podcast listeners. But for all of you watching on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Rumble, we're going to leave it here for you all. Head on over to the podcast forum. But for you podcast listeners on Spotify, Apple, iHeart, Pandora, Amazon, all those podcast listeners, stay with us, because after this, we're going to talk about how much the legislature hates the citizen, or legislative leadership hates citizens, wants us to be disengaged and possible. We'll take a look at a policy they have going on right now. We'll be covering that after this short break.